You will not believe your eyes. This moment, which unfolded in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace before the eyes of thousands, was shocking enough to go down in history. A few seconds earlier, everything was proceeding with the magnificent order of the ceremony. Until the princess stood before Sergeant Major Alistair Finch of the Palace Guard. But something unexpected happened in this encounter. Why did the world's most beloved princess waste her famous smile? Why did a guard, in defiance of all protocol, not even move his gaze? What lay behind the tension that spread like a cold wind through the crowd? Finch's eyes were not seeking a smile that drew applause, but meaning and the weight of character. He knew how the person everyone called the people's princess could make ruthless decisions behind the scenes. And on that day, he chose to remain loyal not to popularity, but to the values he believed in. As the princess's words, "Do I not deserve a smile, Sergeant Major?" hung in the air, Finch's cold-blooded reply struck the heart of the crowd, "My duty is to the crown, Your Majesty. Not to the theater." This two-word blow left the smile on her face frozen like a statue. And that is how the true meaning of loyalty was shown to the whole world that day. To not miss the unforgettable moments of history, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because there are bigger stories to come. The air was damp and cool, with the typical English grey that had settled over the city. The proud iron gates of Buckingham Palace stood silent, as if guarding the centuries-old secrets of an empire. In front of these iron bars, a river of tourists from all corners of the world flowed, a temporary current of curiosity filled with whispers in different languages. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the same point, the King's Guard in his red tunic and black, furry bearskin hat. He was as motionless as a stone statue, a living, breathing part of a moment in which time itself had frozen. One of these guards was Corporal Thomas "Tommy" Davis. 26 years old, yet in his eyes, he carried the weariness and wisdom of a 30-year war. For him, this duty was not just a ceremony. It was a promise to the friends he had lost in the dusty lands of Helmand Province, to his country, and to the honor of the uniform he wore. The weight of that famous bearskin cap on his head, the cold metal of the L-85A2 rifle on his shoulder, and the discipline of his ironed red tunic were, for him, the only fortress he could take refuge in within a chaotic world. To most tourists, he was just a photo opportunity, a souvenir from London. But Tommy knew that beneath that uniform stood a soldier, ready for combat at any moment, alert to every sound, every movement. He didn't see the crowd, he was scanning for potential threats, reading people's body language, protecting the fragile order that could be shattered at any moment. But on that day, there was someone who had come to break that order. A group of three pushed through the crowd to the front. These youths, whose noisy laughter seemed to mock their surroundings, were a stark contrast to the historical atmosphere around them. The group's leader was a young man named Leo, who was live-streaming every moment with the latest model phone in his hand, a smug expression on his face. He saw the King's Guard not as a soldier, not as a human being, but as a part of his show, a gag that would earn him ratings on his social media account. "Hey, guys, look at this," Leo said, turning his camera towards the guard. There was a clear taunt in his voice. "Look at this toy soldier. I wonder if he ever blinks?" His friends burst into laughter. Some people in the crowd looked at them with unease, while others waited with curiosity to see what would happen. Not a single muscle moved on Corporal Davis's face. He was used to such provocations. The protocols he had rehearsed hundreds of times in training flashed through his mind: do not react. Avoid contact. Focus on your duty. But Leo wasn't satisfied with that. He had tasted the fame and wanted more. Slowly, with steps as if he were dancing, he began to approach the guard. His movements were a clumsy parody, imitating Corporal Davis's rigid and motionless stance. "Look, I'm just like him," he shouted. "But I've got life in me." These words were not just a joke, but an insult. It was a sign of disrespect towards the values carried by Davis and thousands of soldiers like him, towards their sacrifice and their discipline. Tommy did not take his eyes off Leo for a single moment. The world in his mind was split in two. On one side, the meaningless actions of this ignorant youth for social media; on the other, the whisper of his commander during a night ambush in Afghanistan, his heart pounding in his throat: "Stay calm, son. He who controls his fear, controls the battle." Leo now stood right in front of the velvet rope that separated the guard from the public. This rope was not just a boundary, but also a symbol. A symbol of respect, of order, and of inviolability. Leo winked at his camera, as if to say, "Now the real show begins." Although some people in the crowd raised their voices with "Don't do it," and "Respect the rules," these voices were lost in Leo's laughter. He hesitated for a moment, then, Gathering his courage, he ducked under that symbolic rope and stepped into the forbidden zone. He was no longer a tourist. He was an aggressor. He had violated not only a physical boundary but also an unwritten code of honor. Now he was just a few steps away from Corporal Davis. On his face was the arrogant smile of a triumphant commander. The crowd held its breath. The surrounding noise was suddenly cut off, replaced by a tense silence. It was as if time had frozen. And in that moment, the ceremony was over, and a completely different protocol was about to be engaged. The blood flowing in Corporal Davis's veins was not blood, but centuries of discipline, and that discipline was now preparing to respond. The step Leo took into the forbidden zone was like a lightning bolt hanging in the air. For a moment, everything truly froze. The red light of Leo's camera blinked, carrying his arrogant smile to the digital world. He thought he was leaving his mark on this stage of history, that he had bent the rules and defeated this motionless figure before him. But he was mistaken. Because Corporal Davis was not a figure. He was the sum of training, tradition, and combat experience. The moment Leo's hand rose slightly, even if in jest, to touch the barrel of the rifle, the protocol of 100 years came to life. Something inside Davis snapped, but it wasn't his patience. It was the sound of a switch flipping from ceremonial mode to combat mode. The first movement was felt not by the eyes, but by the ears. Corporal Davis's heavy, hobnail boot rose as if drawing power from the depths of the earth and slammed onto the stone pavement with incredible speed and force. The sound it made was as sharp and sudden as a gunshot. Crack. This was not just a sound. It was a warning, a line drawn, and a demonstration of power. The sound echoed off the palace walls, vibrating through Leo's entire body. At the same time, a voice rose from the depths of Davis's chest, as harsh and clear as a commander's order to his soldiers on the battlefield. Stay away from the King's Guard. This was not a request. It was not a proposal open for discussion. It was a command that demanded absolute obedience, needing no explanation. The smug smile on Leo's face shattered like glass and fell to the ground. His eyes widened. His face turned pale in an instant. The toy soldier he had been mocking just seconds before had now transformed into a breathing threat, filled with fury and discipline. The hand holding the phone was trembling, almost dropping the device. In that moment, he understood that this was not a game. This was real. The expression he saw in the man's eyes was not an actor's role, it was the cold, calculating gaze of a soldier accustomed to facing danger. The howled breaths of the crowd gave way to whispers of astonishment. Leo's friends were no longer laughing. Their faces showed confusion and a hint of fear. No one had expected such a reaction. They had thought the guard would either remain motionless or weakly say, "Please step back." But this was something entirely different. This was the raw, unprocessed power of discipline. For Corporal Davis, this action was instinctive. His brain had issued the command without analyzing the threat's distance, angle, or type. For him, anyone who came within inches of his uniform was a potential threat. He had witnessed a terrorist disguised as a child blow himself up in a marketplace in Helmont. Since that day, he knew that danger has no form, age, gender, or race. Danger could be hidden in anything that broke the rules and crossed the lines. His reaction stemmed not from personal hatred for Leo, but from his unwavering loyalty to the values he protected. He was not just protecting himself, but everything he represented, the crown, his country, the honor of the uniform. Leo stumbled back a few steps, as if pushed by an invisible force. His feet tangled, and he almost fell. He didn't even know how he scrambled back under the velvet rope so quickly. Now he was back in the crowd, on the safe side. But nothing was the same anymore. He was not the victor. He was a defeated man who had learned his lesson in front of the whole world, paying the price for his arrogance with a sense of shame. The phone was still in his hand, but the live stream no longer mattered to him. Now that camera was recording not his heroism, but his disgrace. This whole incident probably lasted 10 seconds. But at the end of those 10 seconds, everything returned to its previous state. After giving his command and ensuring the threat had passed, Corporal Davis, as if nothing had happened, instantly returned to his motionless, statue-like posture. His eyes were once again fixed ahead, on infinity. His breathing was regular. There was no expression of anger or pride on his face. There was only the unshakable calm of a soldier who had returned to his duty. This silence was more effective than his shout. This stillness sent a more powerful message than his violent action. You can test me, but you cannot break me. Because I am not a person, I am a duty. Leo now understood. The man before him was not a tourist attraction, but a shield carrying the honor of a nation on his shoulders. And that shield was not to be tested. But the story did not end there. Because sometimes, the greatest lessons are learned in the deep silence that begins after the event itself. That deep silence turned into a ringing in Leo's ears. The young man, who just minutes ago thought he was the center of the world, would now have given anything to be invisible. The gazes of the people around him were no longer filled with admiration, but with condemnation and a little pity. They had witnessed how a person's arrogance could crumble in an instant. Leo's friends, as if they didn't want to share this shame with him, had taken a step or two back and were whispering among themselves. No one was laughing anymore. The live stream had long since ended. As Leo put his phone in his pocket with trembling fingers, his eyes inevitably turned back to that red-coated, motionless figure. But this time, he looked differently. He no longer saw a toy soldier before him. He saw a solid fortress wall, an unshakable will, and the living representative of a value system he did not understand, and perhaps never fully would. The incident of a few seconds replayed in Leo's mind over and over. That dry, sharp sound of the boot hitting the stone. And that command. Stay away from the King's Guard. The power in that voice came not from the vocal cords, but directly from the soul. It was the voice not of personal anger, but of an institution, a history, and a code of honor. Leo had spent his life seeking power in money, in popularity, in the number of followers on social media. He believed that power was about attracting others' attention, bending the rules to his advantage. But now, he was learning in a bitter way what true power was. True power was not in shouting, but in being silent when necessary. It was not in moving, but in making one's presence felt even by remaining motionless. True power was not in demanding respect from others, but in earning that respect with your stance, with your character. There was more meaning in Corporal Davis's stillness than in all of Leo's noisy existence. In the crowd, an elderly man holding his grandson's hand leaned down and whispered in the child's ear, "You see, John? That's not anger. That's control. If you want to see what honor looks like, look at that soldier. He's not standing there for himself, he's standing there for all of us." This whisper was, in fact, the shared thought of the entire crowd. People were no longer pushing each other to take a photo of the guard. They were watching him in silence, as if in a sacred space, respecting the deep discipline and spirit of sacrifice he represented. That uniform was not just a piece of cloth. It was the legacy of countless soldiers who had fought and died for Britain, from Waterloo to the shores of Normandy, from the Falkland Islands to the deserts of Afghanistan. That red tunic symbolized their shed blood, and the weight of that black cap symbolized the responsibility they carried. To disrespect this uniform was no different from spitting on a grave. Corporal Davis seemed oblivious to all this. His world was confined to the few square meters where he stood on duty. But he felt everything. The changing energy of the crowd, the respect within the silence, the looks of appreciation that had replaced the mocking gazes directed at him just a while ago. None of this was a source of pride for him. It was simply a natural consequence of his duty. He was there not to be a hero, but to do his job. If this taught others a lesson, it was just a bonus. What do you think? Did Leo really learn a lesson from this incident? Or was it just a fleeting feeling of fear and shame? In the modern world, in this era where social media displays our every moment, are old values like honor and dignity losing their meaning? Or does their importance become even clearer in moments like these? Share your thoughts with us in the comments, because this story is not just about one man, but about all of us. Leo and his friends, not as boisterously as they had arrived, but like the remnants of a defeated army, silently melted away into the crowd. The void and the silence they left behind remained like a monument demonstrating how powerful and inviolable a thing respect is. And Corporal Davis was still there. Motionless, unchanging, and unshakable. Like the last bastion of a world on the verge of being forgotten, he continued to stand his watch of honor. Time flowed at a different pace around the small square where Corporal Davis stood on duty. For the crowd, the incident was over, life went on. But this was a deceptive normality. A careful eye could see the subtle but significant change in the crowd's behavior. Loud laughter was no longer heard, people spoke to each other in lower voices. Many, especially those who came with their children, had put their phones in their pockets. You could see some fathers pointing out the guard to their sons and whispering something, perhaps explaining what respect, discipline, and silent strength meant. People felt they were no longer looking at a tourist attraction, but at a living monument, an inviolable symbol. For Corporal Davis, however, the incident had been archived the moment it happened. His brain, like a military computer, had analyzed the situation, given the necessary response, neutralized the threat, and sent the file to the closed folder. For him, this was not a personal matter. It was the execution of protocols. He was not angry with Leo. He didn't even hate him. He just felt a moment of professional pity for his ignorant courage. The fact that the young man would never know what real danger, what real consequences were, was on one hand his fortune, and on the other, his greatest misfortune. This thought took his mind to another time, another place. Memories sometimes come unbidden. The burning sun of Helmand province, the chaotic noise of the Songin market appeared before his eyes. The mixture of spice and dust in the air. The weight of the equipment on his shoulders, how his body armor constricted his chest. Back then, Davis, still an inexperienced soldier, felt his nerves were on edge. He expected a threat from every corner, every window. At that time, his commander, Sergeant McGregor, walking calmly beside him, began to speak as if reading his thoughts. "Look, Davis," he had said in his gravelly voice. "The enemy's strength is their fanaticism, their love for chaos. They are ready to die. Our strength is the exact opposite. Our strength lies in the discipline we build to live and to let live." McGregor had stopped and looked at an old man in the village square. Discipline isn't just about keeping your boots clean or holding your weapon correctly. And it's certainly not for punishing others. Discipline is the art of controlling yourself when the world around you turns to hell. It's the only thing that separates us from the savages on the other side. Listen not to your fear, but to your discipline. It will always lead you down the right path. Sergeant McGregor had lost his life in a mine explosion 2 weeks later. But his words were etched onto Davis's soul like a tattoo. Today, beneath that toy soldier uniform, it was actually the legacy of Sergeant McGregor that had responded to the young man named Leo. It was a reaction born not of fear, but of discipline. It was Davis's art of self-control. This watch was not just a 2-hour duty for him. It was a kind of meditation, a process of self-discovery. The beads of sweat under the cap, the itching skin, the pain in his shoulders, the physical discomfort of standing motionless. All these were small trials that tested his will. He did not reject these feelings, he accepted them, he mastered them. Ignoring every urge to scratch, enduring every ache, were small victories that forged his will like steel. He knew he was just one of countless guards who had stood on this stone pavement. Generations of soldiers before him had stood here, at this very spot, protecting their kings and queens with the same silence. In rain, in snow, in storms. They were the unbreakable links in a tradition as unchanging as time itself. Davis was honored to be a part of this chain. This was a feeling that meant more to him than thousands of likes on social media. A child's voice was heard from the crowd. A little girl, about 5 years old, holding her mother's hand, whispered as she looked at Davis in awe, "Mummy, is he a real hero?" Davis heard the child's voice. According to protocol, he could not react at all. But for a fleeting moment, for a fraction of a second, the steel-like hardness in his eyes softened. It was a change so small that no one could see it, no one could feel it. But in that moment, the man inside the uniform saw in that little girl's face the innocence, the future he was protecting. And for that innocence, any sacrifice was worthwhile. In that moment, he silently thanked the little girl for her pure admiration. The sound of regular footsteps approaching from a distance broke his thoughts. The changing of the guard was approaching. His personal trial was over, but the watch of honor was eternal. It would continue in another body, in another soul, but with the same unshakable will. Because this red uniform was the symbol not of individuals, but of the unshakable spirit of a nation. And that spirit never surrenders. As the footsteps of the new guards drew closer, Davis was living the final seconds of his watch, knowing that his duty had been honorably completed. The sound of orderly footsteps was no longer a distant whisper, but the powerful roar of an approaching storm. This was the sound of the changing of the guard ceremony, a military dance repeated every day, in all weather conditions, for hundreds of years, yet equally impressive each time. The crowd, as if directed by an invisible hand, silently made way for the new detachment of guards. The geometric precision in their movements showed that they were not a group of individuals, but a single organism, a being moving with a single will. The simultaneous impact of their boots on the ground, the way their rifles rested on their shoulders at the same angle, the way their gazes were fixed on the same point. All this was the complete opposite of the chaotic, self-centered behavior Leo had displayed a few hours earlier. This was the living embodiment of discipline, of the individual's ego being transcended to serve a greater purpose. For Corporal Davis, these sounds were like a bell signaling the end of a long intense watch. But this was not a moment of relaxation. On the contrary, it was a moment when concentration had to reach its peak. Every detail, every movement of the ceremony was memorized, but he knew that the slightest mistake could disrupt this magnificent harmony. The voice of the sergeant commanding the new detachment cracked in the air like a whip. His sharp and clear orders were immediately translated into movement by the soldiers' bodies. Corporal Davis and the other old sentries, in response to these commands, turned, stepped, and moved their rifles from one position to another in perfect unison, as if they were puppets controlled by strings. Their movements were so synchronized that it was difficult for an outsider to tell who was the old guard and who was the new. Finally, the moment arrived. The new guard who would replace Corporal Davis stood before him. For a brief moment, just for a second, the eyes of the two soldiers met. In this look, there was a meaning too deep to be expressed in words. This was not just a change of shifts. It was a transfer of responsibility, of honor, and of a heavy burden. Davis's eyes said, "The watch is yours. Protect this post, this uniform, and everything it represents." The new soldier's gaze replied, "Rest easy. The duty continues. The legacy is in safe hands." This silent dialogue created an invisible but unbreakable bond between them. They were brothers who knew each other not by name, but by the weight of the duty they carried. After handing over his duty, Corporal Davis joined the detachment called the Old Guard and began to march away from the palace courtyard with the same orderly steps as they had arrived. He was no longer a motionless figure fixed on a single point. He was in motion again, part of a whole again. His steps had become lighter. The weight of that solitary responsibility on his shoulders was now shared among the entire detachment. This was more of a spiritual relief than a physical one. He was no longer the target of the world's gaze. He was once again among his brothers, in his own world. As he walked away, he glanced back one last time at the crowd. People were no longer looking at individual guards, but at the entire ceremony, at that magnificent military belly. Davis realized that the unpleasant incident from a few hours ago was perhaps necessary. It had reminded people that what they were seeing was not a tourist show, but a military tradition with deep roots and meaning. Leo's disrespect, ironically, had brought the meaning of respect back into focus. As they passed through the palace gates and headed towards the barracks, Davis felt he was in a safe harbor again. This was their world. Here, everything had an order, a meaning. Here, no one expected a meaningless smile from him, no one mocked his posture. Here, everyone knew what the man under that uniform had been through, what sacrifices he had made. Meanwhile, a few hundred meters from where the incident had occurred, Leo sat on a park bench, watching the same video on his phone. But this time, he was focused not on his own arrogant moments, but on the guard's sharp movement, on that unshakable stance. There was no longer anger or shame on his face. Just the thoughtful, calm expression of a person who had encountered something he did not understand. For the first time in his life, he was considering that power could lie not in noise, but in silence, not in movement, but in stillness. That day, while trying to gain a few followers for social media, Leo had instead received a lesson he would never forget for the rest of his life. And this lesson was more valuable than any school or book could ever teach him. Corporal Davis and his detachment had now disappeared from public view, submerged in the tranquility of the barracks. The curtain had fallen, but the life behind the stage continued. And that life was far more real, and far more honorable, than what the audience saw. The air in the long, functional corridors of the barracks was completely different from the ceremonial atmosphere of the palace courtyard. Here, the sharp smell of polish, gunpowder, and cleaning agents mixed with the heavy scent of sweat. This was the backstage, the place the public never saw, but where hundreds of soldiers sweated every day to make that magnificent performance possible. Here, there was no marble, but old linoleum, no golden decorations, but practical metal lockers. This was the place of work, not of show. Corporal Davis stood in front of his locker and began to perform the final ritual of the watch, removing the uniform. And this process itself required as much care and order as a ceremony. First, he took off the heavy, black bearskin cap. The deep, red mark it left on his forehead was the physical proof of the burden he had carried for hours. This mark would fade in a few hours, but the mark of responsibility he carried in his mind and soul was permanent. Then, he unfastened the shiny buttons of the red tunic one by one. It was as if he were shedding an armor, a public identity. That uniform was a shield for him, but at the same time, a cage that kept him from being Tommy. He folded the tunic neatly and placed it in his locker, ready for tomorrow's watch. When he took off his heavy, polished boots, he felt his aching feet, sore from standing motionless all day, finally relax. He was no longer Corporal Davis, a symbol of the King's Guard. He was Tommy, tired but relieved, dressed in a simple soldier's uniform. The other soldiers around him were performing the same silent ritual. There was very little talk among them. They didn't need words to communicate. They understood the weariness on each other's faces, the order in each other's movements, and they silently respected the burden each other carried. This was an unbreakable bond of brotherhood, forged in trusting each other on the battlefield and in the toughest training. Tommy sat on the edge of his cot and closed his eyes for a moment. The day's events passed before his eyes like a film reel. Leo's arrogant smile, the sound of his boot, the shocked silence of the crowd, the orderly steps of the changing of the guard. He realized once again that he lived in two different worlds. One was the world outside the palace gates, a chaotic, impatient world where everything was instantaneous, where respect was easily forgotten, and where attention was focused on whoever shouted the loudest. The other was the world within these walls, a world where everything had an order, a meaning, a history, where silence was strength and discipline was honor. He didn't hate the world outside. He knew that his duty was to protect that chaotic, sometimes ungrateful world, even when the inhabitants of that world disrespected the very values that protected them. Because true strength was not in punishing the Leos or looking down on them. True strength, as Sergeant McGregor had said, was to be able to maintain one's own order, one's own dignity, even in the midst of all that chaos. True strength was doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. These old traditions, these seemingly meaningless ceremonies, were in fact a kind of life support for these values to stay alive. They were stone monuments that reminded a nation where it came from and on what sacrifices it was built. With these thoughts, Tommy stood up and walked to the window. In the distance, the lights of London were beginning to come on. Millions of people were living their own lives, their own stories. And the vast majority of those millions of people would never think that one of the reasons they could sleep peacefully tonight was that heavy, red uniform worn by a few hundred young soldiers. That didn't matter. Because their duty was not to be applauded, but simply to be done. If this story made you think, don't forget to like our video and subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell so you can continue to watch the stories of values and honor. And share this story with friends who you think need to know what true strength looks like. Because sometimes, the greatest acts of heroism are not performed in front of cameras, but inside a uniform, in the depths of a soul, in silence. Remember, true power is not about tearing others down, but about holding fast to your values with unshakable loyalty. Thank you for watching.